Welcome to Lloyd's Futureset, the Experts Take series. Joining me today is Ann Pettifor, a British economist and author of The Case for a Green New Deal. Hello there, Ann.
Hello.
I want to start by asking you, how would you explain the major risks that the climate crisis brings with it if it isn't mitigated against?
I think there are three big major risks. And the first one is ocean warming is a very big threat to our major cities, our major conurbations, where millions of people live. And we know from the experience of Hurricane Sandy what that can do to a big city like New York. So ocean warming threatens not just New York, but also London, Dubai, Shanghai, Jakarta. And there are massive concentrations of people in those cities. So that's a very big problem. The second big problem is that our invasion of wildlife habitats, our encounter with wildlife, has produced more pandemics. And the scientists are telling us that there are more pandemics in the pipeline. And some scientists are arguing that the next pandemic is going to be even worse than COVID-19. And I find that really scary. And the third big risk is that starving people in regions where agriculture has been decimated by fire, droughts, and flood will move in very large numbers to areas where food is grown.
How much do you think that systemic risks around climate are understood and prepared for by business owners today?
There have been some companies that have been very alive to this crisis and that have taken action, shortened supply lines, and done everything possibly could to transform their businesses to adapt to this threat. But there are others that have just set their face against the science, the rigor of the science. And I just want to say this, I think, those companies really have to be prepared for tipping point changes. On the day of his inauguration, the American president cancelled the Keystone Pipeline, just like that. And that's the kind of thing that could happen to companies that refuse to adapt.
So your recent book is called The Case for a Green New Deal, and it argues strongly for a transformation of the global financial system, no less, to combat climate change. What would that achieve?
Well, the plan is to overhaul capitalism, essentially, because capitalism as it functions today, globalization, is generating mountains of credit or debt. And that credit, in turn, is fueling consumption and production, which in turn fuels greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to switch off the spigot of easy money, the spigot of easy credit. And that will transform capitalism. But we believe that that's actually the first step that has to be taken before we can address consumption and production and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the most important aspect of the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal is also about building a self-sufficient economy, about learning to be more resilient and self-sufficient, to have shorter supply lines, to grow our own green beans, if you like, and rather than importing them from Kenya where they're flown to us on a daily basis. This is not sustainable.
How can the global financial markets support a systemic change that you would consider necessary to seriously combat the climate threat?
I think it has to be up to governments and big international financial institutions. We have to learn to manage the international financial system so that it becomes servant of the global economy and of the ecosystem, and not master of the economy and the ecosystem.
You're asking for a massive shift, really, aren't you, in the model of capitalism? It would impede what we've come to call globalization. It would mean a massive role for governments and a big intervention. That'll have downsides too.
This is a massive transformation, and it's necessary if we are to protect human civilization. It's nothing less than that. We have to be prepared to make these changes. And we know it can be done because we've done it in the past. In 1933, when the United States faced a massive economic shock, the 1929 crash, very high levels of unemployment, and a catastrophic environmental breakdown, the Dust Bowl, President Roosevelt took charge and began to transform the international financial system, the American economy, and ultimately the Dust Bowl. And so, it's that kind of change that we need and that we know we're capable of.
You're advocating for much lower consumption. That also impacts on economies, some would say adversely. Why not simply say, let's green demand, let's promote demand for things that do less damage rather than limiting consumption?
So, the Green New Deal is based on the notion that actually we should be attending to humanity's limited needs and not our unlimited wants and desires. Our wants and desires can just expand exponentially. But the ecosystem, the environment in which we live, has boundaries. The planet has boundaries. And so really we're asking people, the choices, do you want to have to be able to go shopping endlessly? Or do you want to survive? It's as simple as that.
What is your view of the UK's 10-point plan to address climate change, and how far does it go towards meeting your idea of what a Green New Deal should look like?
So environmentalists have been warning us of climate breakdown since the 1980s and 90s. And so my first response is, it's about time. But I have to say that it is really very welcome to hear the British government and now the American government beginning to acknowledge the emergency that this is and to respond to pressure and to begin to act. So I welcome it, although, of course, it's certainly not enough in terms of financing. That has to be expanded massively once we're through this pandemic.
And what can businesses and individuals actively undertake to mitigate the kind of risks from climate change that worry you so much?
So I'm one of those that thinks it's really not up to individuals. Individuals really can't act unless governments and local governments provide them with a framework in which they can recycle, reuse, reduce, or repurpose their consumption. And so really what it requires is for government and businesses to provide us with those frameworks. Once they do that, then individuals will be empowered to act.
Thank you for being in conversation with me today.
It's been a pleasure.